Minnesota. Good, good. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about stats today. The work, check. I think you need to put the mouse. Yeah, click on it. Perfect. Cool. So thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for joining and for inviting me, first of all, and sitting in what I think is for me, those of you taking my class, I have a passion for the science of biomechanics. So I teach both the undergrad and graduate level biomechanics at Point Loma, as well as statistics, research methods. I do a ton of research in this space, so therefore research design and innovative ways to analyze big data, such as machine learning driven types of models, is kind of my areas of interest. And I try to motivate students and encourage them to explore opportunities in space. A lot of them want to go to PT. Nothing wrong with PT. Nothing wrong with being an athletic trainer. But part of my job as a scientist is to promote the career, the vocation path as a biomechanist. So that there are actual positions out there, not just in Major League Baseball, but in the NFL and the NBA and throughout different organizations throughout the country, throughout the world, where they hire actual kinesiologists and biomechanists. So this talk is kind of an introduction into that space. I'm sure many of you have taken biomechanics both as an undergrad as well in PT school, I imagine, in some form, shape or form, whether it's gait analysis or sports biomechanics. So I'll briefly describe what it is that we do as a biomechanist. And I'll give a couple examples that we do in jumping analysis, looking at the counter movement jump. I like looking at the jump because if I had to choose one movement pattern to explain kinematics, kinetics, and electromyography, muscle activation, it would be the jump, right? My area of interest, I'd say 90% of my research is in baseball, whether it's baseball pitching or hitting. I think many of you know that pitching-related injuries is actually pretty prevalent across all levels of baseball. So there's a lot of interest into the mechanics, into the kinematics, kinetics, and energy flow associated with baseball pitching. So we will dabble a little bit on a couple of these human movements, these sports-related movements, and talk about energy flow, mechanical energy, right? So hopefully to wrap things up under 45 minutes or so. And feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. If something goes over your head, I do put some equations here and there. Those of you who've taken my class know I love math. I love numbers, but I try not to inundate my students. Most of my students, as I mentioned, go on to be clinicians, right? PTs, OTs, some do get their PhDs. So I kind of just ease our way into the math and physics part. So anyone know what this famous painting is, drawing? By Trivia Man, right? And sorry, I should have covered that a little bit. So Vitruvian Man, I like this one. In fact, Stanford University has a great biomechanics program that's led by Dr. Scott Delp. And one of their programs is a study abroad program in Italy, where you team up both with the art department as well as the mechanical engineering department, and you spend a semester there and learn about the origins of biomechanics, whether it's Galileo. Borelli is considered the grandfather of biomechanics. So they study both the art and science involved in the physics of human movement. And if I had to define what exactly is biomechanics, you just got to think of the two words, bio. I think everybody here knows what the bio part is. And mechanics goes to the physics involved in that, the statics and dynamics. So it's a study of movement of living things using the science of mechanics. And it's very important to emphasize when I say bio, it doesn't necessarily mean humans. Yes, obviously we're interested in human movement, but it can refer to a plant, a dog, a horse. There's actually a lot of research on equine biomechanics, for example. In Berkeley, they have an animal biomechanics lab where they focus on canine, like looking at biomechanics of dog, which is really cool. But my area of interest, and I'm sure many of your interests, are in the human part, right? The human mechanics and mechanics of human movement. So mechanics is the branch of physics that's specifically concerned to the statics and dynamics of movement. So we are governed by what's called Newtonian mechanics, classical physics, because we're here on Earth. So, our gravity is pulling us at an acceleration of 9.81 meters per second squared. We move our muscles. That generates all the forces and torques that accelerate the segments and accelerates our center of gravity when we're walking, running, cutting, jumping, whatever. So we use these kind of basic mechanics to quantitatively understand what human movement is about. And the reason why biomechanics it's so important, especially as clinicians, is because you could quantify something, you can objectively examine someone's movement, whether it's pathological or perhaps in player development, you're looking at ways to improve the efficiency of athletic movement. So statics is a study of systems in state of equilibrium. And that means that the human body or the segment is either at rest or moving at a constant velocity. Anyone remember which Newtonian laws of motion that was? Called the law of inertia. It's first, second, or third. Do you guys remember that? You guys are looking at me. This is high school stuff. Yeah. First law of motion, yeah. So it's the first law. Sir Isaac Newton came up with these laws of motion. The first law is the law of inertia, that an object such as us, or such as this, such a baseball or football, will remain in that constant unless acted upon by a net external force. And I'll come back to it in a second. Once it's moving, then it's dynamic, as you know. So the area of mechanics that we call dynamics is the study of systems in a state of accelerated or changing motion. Accelerated or changing motion. I like this. I take this from Dwayne Knudsen's article in the Fundamentals of Biomechanics, where he describes that biomechanics provides the conceptual and mathematical tools that are necessary for understanding how living things move and how kinesiology professionals might improve movement or make movement safer. And you could see I like using Venn diagrams, kind of the overlap between the various sciences that we as human movement professionals are concerned about. So biomechanics, obviously, exercise physiology, motor control and learning, psychosocial, pedagogy. I'm sure many of you have taken motor control classes for XPhys, right? VO2 max and things like that. Those are all interrelated. So we come as biomechanists to add our piece to the equation to understand human movement. So the application of biomechanics, you can say, is limitless. And I'm really only touching the surface when it comes to human movement biomechanics. So I'm going to give you a few examples. One example, I'm sure, have you guys done gait analysis labs yet? You guys going to prior to? So I set up the clinical gait analysis lab here at Rady Children's. I used to be their director at the old center when I was at SDSU, and now set up their brand new facility. So all of these gait labs, these clinical gait labs across the country, hire physical therapists. And if it's at a children's, it usually is a pediatric, a PT. They hire a kinesiologist, a biomechanical engineer, and obviously they're run by the medical directors, who are typically orthopedic surgeons, right? And so you've got patients or children who are afflicted with some neuromuscular disorder, such as cerebral palsy or myelomeningocele, spina bifida, that prevents them from walking normally. So the clinicians would then send their patients as a referral to the gait analysis lab to get a quantitative three-dimensional kinematic, kinetic, and EMG capture of what that patient is doing. That allows the clinicians, the PT, the orthopedic surgeon, the referring physicians, to see what's really going on underneath and then make some informed decisions about treatment, whether it's surgical or non-surgical, right? So this is why biomechanics is so important. The biomechanists, I remember at the Gait Lab, we would meet every Friday. We have the report ready to go. We've got their videos, all the clinicians, all the engineers got gathered together, and we just go through all the cases that we have for the week. My job as the biomechanist to interpret all the numbers, to those kinematic and kinetic variables, put some operational definitions for those so that the clinicians can understand. So we apply the basics of mechanics to human movement. We use instrumented motion capture. Back in the day, it used to be marker-based. I'll talk about markerless here in a sec. And that provides us the biomechanics of movement. And I don't know if you guys remember, did anyone know the difference between kinematics and kinetics? Talk a lot about this. This is very important. And the reason why I have this arrow pointing down to kinematics, and apologize, I got cut off there, is because what we see when we see someone walking or running is things like knee flexion extension, abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation. We can quantify that. You don't even necessarily need a sophisticated mocap system to do that. You can use your iPhone, you can use a goniometer, electrogoniometers. So that's what we quantify. So kinematics is the geometry of three-dimensional motion. That's what we see. What we want to know is what's causing or changing that motion. That's where the kinetics comes in. Kinetics are those torques and forces that cause or change the motion. Things like gravity, things like muscular contraction. All our muscles generate motion or accelerate our segments and joints because they create torques at the respective axes of rotations. So that's why we have this. And the kinetics part gives those the sources of what's causing the movement that we see, whether it's pathological or not, and then tie in what we observe in our kinematics. So the two perspectives that I mentioned, kinematics, is the geometry of motion, looking at both the spatial and temporal characteristic of motion without regard to the forces and torques that cause them, whereas kinetics, we're actually looking at those specific forces. So we've got a number of sophisticated tools and models that allow us to estimate what these forces and torques are, as well as measure all the kinematics and kinetics. Or did you need to? Yeah, for sure. I'm sure you've heard the terms before, right? Can just kind of mix up. Don't worry, I get students all the time who get these two mixed up all this. So it's very important to understand that. All right, so I got this flow chart on how everything is interconnected between biology and physics. The biology part are all the physiological mechanisms by which movement is generated or changed, right? I'm not going to go into that. I think you guys have a really good understanding of your anatomy and phys, right? Both as an undergrad as well as a grad student. So your neuromuscular system, obviously your musculoskeletal system. What we're concerned as biomechanists is this part right here. My pointer doesn't point it. So statics and dynamics that will allow us to quantify both the kinematics and kinetics of human movement. So I talked about Sir Isaac Newton, right? Newtonian laws, or what's called classical physics, and everything that we do in, in biomechanics is to understand the relationship between segments and all these forces and torques according to the laws of motion, law of inertia, law of acceleration, and law of action-reaction. I think Newton's third law is one that students often remember, because for every action there is a equal and opposite reaction. Very important, right? What Sir Isaac said is that forces work in pairs. So while I'm standing here at a force of, let's just say 160 pounds, right? I'm not going to get too accurate there, but 160 pounds, the ground right now is putting a load on me at 160 pounds. That's the ground, what we call the ground reaction force. So therefore, the net force right now is 0, even though there are still forces there. So very, very important. I'll say things like net external force. And if I say the net force is 0, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are no forces involved. It just simply means that the sum of all the forces happen to be 0. And that's according to Newton's first law of inertia. So when the net force is equal to 0, that means the object is not accelerating. It could be moving at a constant speed or a constant velocity, but the acceleration is 0. So let's talk about those sources of forces and torques. I think many of you understand muscles, right? So that's the main, I guess, source that generate or accelerate the joints and segments that I mentioned earlier. You can see it's all through the muscle contraction, myosin, actin. You guys went through the cross-bridge theory many, many times before, right? So I'm not going to go into that into detail there. Another one, of course, is gravity. We are affected, all of us here on Earth are affected to some shape or form, depending on how high you are from the center of the Earth, around 10 meters per second squared, roughly, right? If you go up to Mount Everest, it's slightly lower, just slightly. And if you go down to Death Valley, it's actually slightly higher. So if you find you gain a couple of pounds by traveling Death Valley, no worries, it's not you, it's gravity. It's Sir Isaac Newton there. So what we can measure directly is what's called the ground reaction force, or GRF. And we've got force platforms that I think, as many labs do, that allow us to directly measure the three-dimensional GRF, the ground reaction force. So that means both the vertical, not both, but all the vertical the AP, the anterior posterior component of the force, as well as what's called the medial lateral component of the force. So all three directions. It's a very, I don't say sophisticated, but very useful tool that allows us, gives us some great insights as to, even if you didn't have MoCap, great insights into movement, more specifically pathological movement or movement that is abnormal for that patient. Okay, so how do we measure the torques in the body, right? If you think about it, we measure things like muscular torque, the torque that's created by the bicep femoris or the vastus lateralis. We don't use sensors that are embedded in our joints. Maybe some cadaveric research, there's tons of stuff on that, but at least in vivo, we can't. So we have to use what's known as a biomechanical model, right? Or a forward dynamics or inverse dynamics model, which takes in all of the input from motion capture, as well as the force platform, and then using some sophisticated physics, what we call mechanics, we can then estimate the joint reaction and joint reaction torques, as forces and torques, at each joint. So if someone is doing a squat or doing a counter movement jump, we can estimate the amount of force the patella has on the structures, right, on the knee. We can estimate the amount of tensile force there is on the quadriceps. Clinically speaking, sometimes typically we only measure what's called the reaction force. So we're taking all of the contributions of the muscles, the tendons, the other osteokinematic structures that gives us an actual reaction force and torque, and we can put that into our report to understand. So we use forward dynamic simulation to understand the relationship of when the muscles contract and create a movement. But more often than not, when we're trying to estimate torques or forces, we use what's called inverse dynamics. It's called inverse dynamics is because what we see first is kinematics, or those angular rotations, those angular displacement. Did you need to, sorry, 1 second. So while that's up, I apologize here. The screen just kind of went a little weird here. So there we go. This right here is traditional motion capture. As I mentioned earlier, motion captures allow us to get the kinematics directly. We then input that into our inverse kinematics model to measure things like angular velocities, acceleration, as well as displacement. And then if we couple these inverse kinematics along with what's called anthropometric measures, these are things like center of mass of each segment, like center of mass of the femur, center of mass of the upper arm, for example, as what's called radii gyration. So we have all this information from years and years of research, cadaveric research, that allows us to demographically define for each individual, for each patient, what their anthropometrics are like. So by taking anthropometrics and the kinematics, the estimation, put them together, this is somewhat oversimplistic, but we're basically using Newton's second law that says that if something is accelerating and has a mass, there is a net force or a net torque that's acting on that joint, right? Just very oversimplistic, but I wanted to give you at least an idea of how we estimate torque. And everyone know that joint moments and joint torques is the exact same thing. A torque is basically a moment of force. It's the turning effect of a force. Cool. So this way, these equations here is basically extensions. This is the didactic equation for Newton's second law, and this is just the same thing as applied to torques, right? The moment of inertia, as well as what's called the moment arm, multiplied by the change in velocity of a segment, or change in momentum of acceleration. All right, so everyone grab your notes. I want you to write down all of these equations. Don't worry. I don't even have my engineering students do this. So I had to do this as an undergrad, an engineering undergrad, way back in the day by hand, literally by hand. It's called an Euler iterative method, where we go through each segment of the body, starting with the foot, and solve these equations, these derived equations. Fortunately, we have software that does this for us. I think it's been almost 2 decades since I had to do this by hand, but everything is built in there. And we use what's called a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, depending on our areas of interest in measuring joint kinetics for each part of the body. So obviously, I'm interested in the upper body, in pitching, because I'm interested in elbow valgus torque, for example. So we use what's called a bottom-up approach using that same method. And the idea is to go from the distal to proximal segments, and we all meet in the pelvis. Biomechanically speaking, the pelvis is considered to be the root segment of the kinetic chain. And if I had to argue about the kinetic chain, I would say there's actually two kinetic chains. There's one for the upper body and one for the lower body. And everybody knows the difference between open kinetic chain, closed kinetic chain. Sure. So for the lower half, for gait, for example, is typically used. The Newton-Euler method is used in the bottom-up approach, where the equations at the feet are solved first, and then it's moved proximally to the knee and ultimately to the hips. And as well for the upper body, we start with the wrists or hand. If you're talking about baseball, then it starts actually with the hand with the ball, and it goes wrist, elbow, shoulder, and up trunk, and then ultimately to the pelvis. So we meet at the pelvis, biomechanically speaking. All right. So give you an example. Looking at jumping, again, I mentioned this earlier. If I had to choose one movement to describe all of these biomechanical principles, the counter movement jumps makes perfect sense. You get kinematics, so you can see knee flexion extension, triple extension, right? Hip flexion extension, knee flexion extension, ankle would be plantar dorsiflexion, right? And then all the muscles that control those movements, change those movements. In terms of kinetics, what I show you here on the right side of the graph is the vertical ground reaction force and the acceleration of this person's center of gravity. Why are those graphs identical? They're different scales, but they're identical. At least the patterns are. What do you think? It's exactly the same. Why? Even though we're measuring two different things, one is the vertical ground reaction force, and the other one is the acceleration of the person's center of gravity during a jump. Let's see, can we play this real quick? Think about Newton's second law. The net force equals mass times acceleration. And so net force, if we're talking about a jumper, it's simply the vertical ground reaction force and the person's weight. The person's weight should never change, assuming he doesn't put a backpack or anything like that. So the only thing that really changes is the person's ground reaction force. So what you see, can you play it again? Yep. I want you to watch just the vertical ground reaction force. That's the one on the top. He's standing, and all of a sudden he accelerates in the negative direction. He slows down, speeds up. Now he's in the air. Then he lands, high impact, and he, what we call, absorbs that shock. And I use this for my undergrad biomechanics, as my grad biomechanics, to describe the relationship between Newtonian mechanics and what the jumper is doing. So if we start in the first part, I don't know why it's pointing the opposite direction. So right here, the person is now accelerating towards the ground. So we call that negative acceleration. At some point, he or she has to slow down. So what you see here, this first peak, is positive acceleration. He's slowing down, so that therefore the ground reaction force is saying, okay, whoa, you need to come to a stop. Eventually, when you squat, you need to come to a stop. So those same muscles, I want you to start thinking about your anatomy, right? When I'm doing this, I'm just letting go. Your ground reaction force is actually less than your own weight. You're actually falling. You're doing a controlled fall. You ever been in an elevator and started to jump up? You kind of get that weird feeling like you're weightless. That's what that is for a brief moment of time. But at some point, you're going to slow down. Which muscles are firing you to slow down? Your knee is flexing. Are you firing your hamstring during those times? No, you're firing your quadriceps, your hip extensors, your plantar flexor dorsally. You are eccentrically firing them to slow down, to decelerate those segments. And so that deceleration is what's shown here in that first peak. Those same muscles would then contract, right? They're shortened, you get a concentric contraction, and then this is where Newton's third law comes in. That's where the ground reaction force, because if his center of gravity acceleration is higher than 9.81 meters per second squared, he's going to take off. That is rocket science. That's literally rocket science. And what I like showing this is when you see these two graphs in the lab, it makes perfect sense. I said, wait, Sir Isaac Newton was actually right. We could see it. Because when the person is in the air, what should his or her acceleration be while he or she is in the air? What should it be, roughly, do you think? 9.8. In fact, we see that. It's like negative 10 meters per second squared. It's like, oh my goodness, it actually works. This is science. And then the person has to come to, has to for a projectile, what goes up must come down, right? So come down, we use projectile equations to, to estimate the landing velocity. And then from there, we can then estimate how much impact force can be attenuated by the person flexing their knees, right? That's why we tell our athletes, make sure you finish the jump. Some athletes don't do that. A lot of athletes do that, whether it's due to training or just, the way they're thinking about it. They land for jump, go up for a rebound, they land with their knees fully extended. All that impact gets absorbed somewhere, and it most likely gets absorbed by ACL, MCL, meniscus, for example, right? So your muscles are there. Your muscles need to generate, absorb, and transfer energy. That's what they're designed for. That's why strength and conditioning professionals, physical therapists and ATs, they're trained to teach our athletes how to properly move using this science, using this research. That's why the jump to me is such a powerful yet, I think, simple approach in describing the relationship between biomechanics and movement patterns in both player development and, more importantly, in injury risk, right? Click somewhere on the top, maybe. Oh, one more. Here, there we go. So this was a cool one. This is kind of the same example. This is actually one of our students that were doing a pilot on a single jump roping versus double jump roping. And they had them jump on, go ahead and hit play. Had them jump on the force plate. You can see here the ground reaction force on the top graph, and then her acceleration in the bottom graph. You can see when she's in the air. So this one is a pilot study looking at single versus double jump. Obviously, you need someone who can actually do a double jump, which is actually pretty difficult to do, but it's really cool stuff. And we can use all of this information to understand, okay, what separates an elite athlete to an amateur, someone who's first learning, literally first learning the ropes. That's what they're doing. So anyway, use the same tools. Biomechanically speaking, we have motion capture. This is a market-based motion capture. We have an instrumented, not instrumented, but we have a floor instrumented with 2 force platforms, and this is my undergrad lab on campus. I think I might click outside. Sorry about that. All right, cool. So questions on that, the jump off. I like talking about this stuff. Yeah.
You track pattern movement jumps with Padres baseline?
Yeah, quite a bit actually, and there's evidence in the literature that suggests that that counter movement jump performance is a predictor of certain athletic performance metrics, such as in baseball, for example, would be ERA. It could be bat velo. It could be pitch velocity. You familiar with CMJ metrics? So jump height is one of them, right? But there's also rate of force development. There's also reactive strength index. All these metrics that we easily can collect from our athletes have been shown to have good predictive modeling of strength with certain performance metrics that we see on the field as well as in the court. Any other questions on jump off stuff? Perfect. We just opened up a brand new biomechanics lab. This is probably, last week, literally, Patrick came to our open house. So I still have my undergrad biomechanics lab on the main campus. I use it mainly for teaching, and we have market-based motion capture. We just opened this one up on our Balboa campus. If you're not familiar, we have a Balboa campus about 15 minutes away from the main campus and not too far from SDSU that houses OT, PA, MSAT, MS-Kin, and biomechanics. So this is a lab that we partner up with the San Diego Padres. The Padres partially funded the lab. It's a brand new space. It has an interior portion that we just opened up last week and an exterior part that is scheduled to open in January. So this is my dream lab. Taking my undergrad, I talked about a lot about baseball and biomechanics. And so when they asked me to design one, I was like, okay, I'm going to town. This is Christmas for me. So I outfitted the entire thing with everything that I felt was important in understanding the biomechanics of baseball pitching, hitting, fielding, catching, and we also do a gate in there. If you can see here, I'll show you some other pictures, but I put this runway here, and this runway has 2 force plates in there, so it allows us to do gate, walking, running, as well as cutting, some jumping stuff, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll show you in a sec. We do some hurdling. So we've got a hybrid system, a markerless and a marker-based motion capture system. Markerless right now, technology is booming, it's evolving. So you no longer need to put markers on, although it's not as accurate. We're still, I talked about that last week. But if you have an athlete or a team that wants to come in, they can easily get in there and just throw at their natural, setting, their natural intensity, if you will, because they don't have these markers on, which is really cool. So we got a hybrid system. We have an instrumented mound. So that's the pitching mound right here that has force platforms on the rubber side as well as on the down the slope. The batter's box is what's unique to me. Other than a few teams that have these labs internally, we're of maybe 1 or 2 facilities in the country that has an instrumented batter's box. That means the batter's box has 90 by 90 force platforms, 2 of them on each side of the plate for lefties and righties, as well as the motion capture system that you see around the batter's box. We have what's called a TrackMan ball tracking unit. TrackMan unit measures ball flight, spin efficiency, spin rate, and things like that. And what you see here on the top, right above the netting, is what's called a HitTrax simulator. So you can go in there and you can hit a ball and simulate where it goes in any park in the league. So we set up, our obviously Petco in there, or we could set up, Yankee Stadium if we wanted to. And all my grad students go to town there. They just go in there and you can actually play simulated games if you wanted to, which is really cool. So I mentioned earlier, we also do, other movements other than baseball. So these are as an example of an undergrad. She's on our track and field team, and we can also do hurdling, for example. So she jumping off the force plate there. They're looking at different plant positions and understanding the changes in performance and doing hurdling. Here's the thing. I need to back up. I may play one on TV and pretend I know everything there is about pitching, hitting, catching, jumping, hurdling, and I'm in this business because I'm not a good athlete, right? Okay, so I don't pretend to be one. So I tell my athletes, my clients, and coaches, I go, look, you are the expert. I'm a biomechanist. Use me as a tool, as a resource. I'm not going to change your philosophy or your approach. I'm going to help you make the best informed decision about your athletes, about your patient. The same thing when an orthopedic surgeon sends a patient to the gait lab. The gait lab will come up with all the diagnostic, the kinematic assessment, but they're not going to say, okay, doc, you need to do a splat rectus femoris transfer. No, the surgeons will do that, right? So I always like using the MRI analogy. Our biomechanics lab is a dynamic MRI. The MRI, we can interpret all the data, but use us as a resource for the clinicians or the referring coaches and players to make these informed decisions. Sorry. Gotcha. Cool. All right, let's move forward. Let me try. All right, cool. Oh, I'm back. All right, so we are fortunate enough to collaborate with a number of organizations throughout the country. You can see here, Wake Forest actually is one of the first universities to open a pitching lab, a baseball pitching lab. We work closely with Driveline Baseball. In fact, I've sent a number of students and interns to work at Driveline over in Kent, Washington. Obviously, they deal mainly with baseball hitting, pitching, and fielding. And they've sent a ton of people to work in Major League Baseball. CSU Sacramento, where my former PhD advisor is currently working in the Department of Physical Therapy. ASMI, which is the American Sports Medicine Institute, they're one of the first baseball biomechanics labs in the country. Gosh, they opened up in the early, I'll say late 90s, somewhere around there. Cal Poly SLO, we've done some work with them. I still work closely with the Curling Job Institute up in LA, Santa Monica. Work with the Lakers, Dodgers, the Angels, the Kings, you name it. And then the University of Auburn, or Auburn University, where they're big on softball biomechanics. So I'm starting to learn a little bit more about how to analyze the softball pitch, which is obviously different from the baseball pitch. I talk a lot, I nerd out with all of these equipment and math, but at the end of the day, the heart of our lab is our students, our grad students who go through the program and run this lab like a well-oiled machine. I'm very grateful for them every single day. And they go out and do great things. Like we sent alums over to the Padres, Reds, Giants, the Pirates, the Rays, the Driveline, even in the NBA. We had biomechanists working with the Grizzlies, with the Clippers. Curlin Job hired one of our AT/biomechanists. You can't see it down there, but that's the Naval Health Research Center, which is next door to us at Point Loma. So as I mentioned earlier, being a biomechanist is a viable career option for a lot of our students. If for whatever reasons they change their mind about PT school or OT school or PA school, being a biomechanist is one option that they can explore, especially now. The opportunities that are available to a biomechanist, a student that's coming out of the program versus when I first came out of it, I would have jumped the gun on a lot of these opportunities. And in fact, it's come to the point where the demand is exceeding the supply. Right now, this is off season. If you watch baseball, we're in the off seasons. There's a lot of teams who are hiring. And I just literally got a phone call the other day, and they were asking me, hey, do you got any students who are graduating that would be willing to start in January? I go, look, no, they just got hired. I ran out. Call me again in another year. So it's a great time. You get to choose. I had one student who was choosing between the White Sox, the Mariners, as well as the Rays. And he ultimately chose the White Sox. He had a good offer from them. So there are plenty of opportunities. I'm very proud of our alums who work in this space. And not only that, we have a pretty robust research program. And I make it a point that students, when they do a thesis with me, you're going to present. You're going to share your work, whether it's at a national, international conference, but ultimately go publish, right? In this, because the only way that you're going to be recognized in this field, as you know, is through research, right? It's not any different from what you do in PTs. We're in the business of doing evidence-based practice. That evidence is from research. That's how we know to do all of these interventions, or the validity and reliability, all the diagnostic tests that you practice and do, is because of research. So I encourage and make sure that our students and our alums are out there, and during conference season, we pay for them to travel to the UK or to Austria, to present their work, and as well here in the United States. So we were just in Milwaukee for the ASB conference there, or I'm sorry, the ISBS, which is the International Society of Biomechanics in Sport. So very proud of the research and ongoing research that we've been doing the last few years. So this is pictures of us from ACSM. I think many of you are familiar with ACSM. ASB, which is the American Society of Biomechanics in Knoxville, over the summer. And then we are gearing up for winter meetings in 2 weeks here in Nashville. In addition to our lab, every, I'd say March-ish, we take our system to Arizona and we set up shop. The last couple of years I've been with the Padres. We've done that with a few teams, but now that we're exclusive to the Padres, we go there, we set up shop, we see their entire rotation, both at the major league level as well as the minor league level. And because everything is markerless, we can collect them pretty efficiently. And then at the end of the week, we sit down with Coach Niebla, who's the pitching coach, as well as the other members of the baseball operations team, and we go over all of the reports from there. So that's a great opportunity for our students to go. Just recently, we set up shop at Petco. This was just last month, and Major League Baseball contracted us to test out their in-game motion capture system. So every stadium around the league has, I'm sure you've heard of Statcast. If you watch baseball, Statcast is what feeds it's what gets the ball tracking, and whether the type of pitch that was thrown, etc. Well, the technology that's used for that is a motion capture company called Hawkeye, and Hawkeye is based out of the UK. They've done a lot of tennis and golf. So they've expanded to baseball, but there is question as to the validity and reliability of that system. So they hired us to bring our motion capture system out there. We collected data on 20 collegiate pitchers. We're actually still in the process of gathering everything up, and we're presenting at the winter meetings in December. So it was a fun opportunity for our students. I had a team of maybe 10 grad students there, set up cameras for 2 days. At Petco on a beautiful San Diego weather, as you see there, right after the season was over, unfortunately. Padres ended their season a lot earlier than they would like, but it offered us the opportunity to go in there and set up shop. So just kind of give you an idea, I presented this last week. One of the things that we're looking at is the difference in certain kinematic variables that are typically measured in baseball between a marker list system and a marker-based system. So Qualis is the marker-based system, and Thea there is the marker list system that we currently have in our lab. These are just what we call rain clouds or box plots that are embedded with the histograms or what we call histogram densities, and just a fancy way of looking at distributions. Right? So that's the first thing we look at when we're looking at things like hip shoulder separation, which is really just trunk rotation, lead knee flexion as drive for contact. And an obvious one is maximum external rotated position of the throwing shoulder, which typically happens about 50% of the arm cocking position. I can't go that far, but you see here, a lot of pitchers could go past 180 degrees. Crazy stuff. And they could only do that during the pitch. You try to do that, either ask them to do an active range of motion or passive range of motion, you couldn't do it, right? Only during the pitch is possible. You wonder why there's a lot of pitching related injuries, right? Both at shoulder and elbow. Crazy stuff. Oh, can we show that real quick? I like this one. So I'm big on energy flow. And with energy flow, excuse me, we have the ability to quantify energy that's generated, absorbed between segments of the body using Newtonian mechanics. So the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, that's kind of my area of research on both at the major league side as well as high school and collegiate. And so we can measure these energy flow through each segment of the body and map them to each segment during the entire pitch through the kinetic chain. And why is this important? Well, if you talk about efficiency of movement or the efficiency of pitch, you can't talk about efficiency if you're not quantifying energy. Right? There's metabolic energy, sure, there's chemical energy, but mechanical energy is the energy that's associated with movement, what we call mechanics, what I told you earlier. So energy flow analysis is something that we use quite a bit to analyze pitching, but we also do hitting. Oh, there we go. And just to kind of give you an idea of, I'll give you just a quick rundown of what generation, absorption, transfer, and difference of what the differences are. So when a muscle concentrically contracts, it's accelerating the segments, many you know. So therefore, that muscle is generating energy. Easy one, right? The next one, no, it's not. Just click on the perfect. The way we measure that, this is just power. That's the segmental torque power. That's due to the torque and angular velocity of that specific segment. You do not have to write this down or memorize that, but I just show you the underlying equations on which energy flow is based. When the muscle, however, is lengthening, we call it eccentric contraction, as many you know. So therefore, it is decelerating those segments, right? It's slowing down. So it is absorbing energy. So there's energy generation, there's energy absorption, but there's also, oh, I think I got it, transfer. The degree to which a joint torque can transfer energy between segments ultimately determines how efficient that pitcher or that mover is, that task. And we can quantify that transfer. You ever see, oh, bless you. Yeah, if you ever see a guy like who's a Spencer Strider from the Braves versus Clayton Kershaw, right, where they have extra movement. Mark Pryor back in the day would have very efficient fluid movement, and yet they're throwing in the high 90s. And that's because they're efficient. They're using the energy generated by the lower half in order to get that pitch to 90 miles or 95 miles per hour. Younger pitchers can get there. Collegiate pitchers can clock in the mid-90s, but they do so at energy costs here at the shoulder and elbow. So it's the analogy I always use, you know, if you're throwing a punch and you do this, you can get more power and more efficiency if you use your entire body, right? Because you're more than 50% of your total body mass is here, your trunk and your pelvis. Mass times velocity is momentum. Mass times velocity squared is energy. So if you can do this in a pitch, if you can get the kinetic chain to work, you can transfer that energy, what they call up the chain, properly. And all's due to training. And that's the key thing, is that we could quantify the contributions of each muscle through the segments of the amount of energy generated, absorbed, and transferred. And we can begin to understand, okay, what separates that elite, more efficient, less injury risk, type of pitcher versus someone who's still kind of learning or who gets hurt a lot, for example. See, how are we doing on time? Okay, so let's breeze through this. Let's skip all the equation stuff. I'm almost done, promise. All right. I nerd out on this stuff. This is, I love talking about this. So energy transfer real quick. The best analogy I use is, you're lying in a supine position, trying to get up. I still do this because I'm getting old. I, put my legs up and then I swing my legs forward, isometric contract my hip muscles. What do? You move forward. You transfer energy from your lower half to your upper body. That's basically energy transfer. And the ability, if you could feel yourself just kind of just throwing a football or throwing a baseball, you do this, you kind of feel. You ever see Dak Prescott, Cowboys? He does this a lot, right? And so he's transferring energy from one half to the next. And so we could quantify that amount of energy from each segment to the next that is materialized by the muscles. So from the lower half to the upper half. If you're interested in the math at all, scan this QR code. I made what's called a Shiny app. The Shiny app will give you the relationships between angular velocities of these segments and energy generated, absorbed, and transferred. Don't worry, you're not going to be tested on this. But I showed this at the kind of an engineers meeting, and they ate this up. They're all scanning it up, so don't worry about it. So to give you how it looks, is the rate of energy transfer at the stride hip. Stride hip is the front hip here. Very important. What's the old adage is that energy moves up the chain is oversimplistic. Yes, it does move up the chain through L5S1, but there's still some energy that moves down the chain. It has to, because at this stage of the throw, the pelvis actually rotates first, right? It actually rotates before the front foot contacts the ground. So at that point, the pelvis is actually slowing down. The trunk is now accelerating. So as the pelvis is slowing down, energy is being absorbed by that front hip. So think about what causes pelvic rotation? It's actually hip rotation. All the muscles that hip abductors, hip rotators, all those muscles we focus on with our pitchers on hip mobility and strength. In order to materialize, to make sure that they get this nice energy transfer as they go down the stride foot contact. And we see it both at the collegiate levels, which is the graph in white, as well as in the high school pitchers, which is the blue line there. Hitting the same thing. I promise I'm almost done. I wanted to show this. There's really cool stuff. So we can do energy flow of an actual hitter. This is actually one of our hitters from the pro ranks that came in. If you follow Dodgers, you might recognize that player. I won't say who because I'm now under contract by the Padres, not to mention any other team, but just kind of give you an example of how that looks on the energy side. Screws through, hip transfer. Cool. And that's it. Sorry, I went a little bit over time.
Thank you so much, Dr. E, for that.
Yeah,
1 second. I am going to conclude the recording.